Ladies and gentlemen, what stands out most coming out of Pittsburgh right now is that the conversation around the Steelers is no longer just about who they drafted. It's about what these moves reveal about the organization's bigger plan for 2026. When you dig into everything that's happened since the draft wrapped up, there's a very clear message coming from inside the building. This franchise believes it has positioned itself to take a significant step forward, and several of these under-the-radar additions could end up being far more important than most fans realize. The first sign of that growing confidence is how the Steelers are already being viewed across the league. After the offseason reshaping of the roster, Pittsburgh has climbed to number 11 in post-draft NFL power rankings, moving up from 14th and even sitting one spot ahead of the Baltimore Ravens. That kind of jump doesn't happen by accident. It reflects a growing belief that this roster has been upgraded in key areas, especially with the infusion of young talent that could contribute immediately. One of the names generating the strongest early buzz is Jeremy Bernard. The second-round wide receiver out of Alabama is already being projected by some analysts as the rookie most likely to make the biggest impact in Pittsburgh this season. And when you look at what offensive coordinator Brian Angelicchio had to say about him, it's easy to understand why there's so much excitement. Angelicchio emphasized Bernard's energy, character, and overall makeup as a player and person, calling him highly productive and pointing to the strong football culture he comes from at Alabama. That matters in Pittsburgh. This organization has always placed enormous value on players who fit the culture as much as the system. The intriguing part is where Bernard fits immediately. He projects as the third receiver right away, and there's real optimism that his polish as a route runner could allow him to contribute faster than most rookie receivers typically do. Of course, there's still the quarterback question hovering over everything. If Aaron Rodgers ends up under center, Bernard will have to navigate Rodgers' well-documented tendency to be cautious with rookie receivers until they fully earn his trust. If that doesn't happen, then the spotlight shifts toward younger quarterback options like Drew Aller or Will Howard. Either scenario creates uncertainty, but it also creates opportunity. For a polished receiver stepping into a meaningful role, all it takes is a few early flashes to become a central part of the offense. And speaking of Drew Aller, that pick continues to divide opinion across Steelers Nation. Even Ben Roethlisberger weighed in, and his reaction was about as honest as it gets. He admitted he's still unsure whether he loves or hates the selection, pointing out that while Aller has the size, mobility, and arm strength Pittsburgh traditionally values, he never saw those truly jaw-dropping moments that made him think this guy is definitely the answer. That's a fascinating evaluation because it mirrors what a lot of fans are feeling right now. The physical tools are there, the upside is undeniable, but there are still legitimate questions about whether Aller can become the franchise quarterback this team has been searching for. His 2025 production won the 100 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions across 6 games shows promise, but it's hardly enough to erase all doubts. This is very much a projection pick, and how Pittsburgh develops him could define the next several years of the franchise. But while the quarterback debate will dominate headlines, some of the Steelers' most immediate rookie impact might come from a completely different area: special teams. That brings us to Wetjen. There's growing belief that he could step in as Pittsburgh's starting kick and punt returner from day one. With Calvin Austin III now with the New York Giants, that role is wide open, and Wetjen enters with elite return credentials from college. This could end up being one of those draft picks fans initially question, only to later realize just how valuable it was. Field position remains one of the most underrated factors in football, and if Wetjen delivers explosive returns early in the season, this selection will start looking a lot smarter very quickly. And then there's the undrafted free agent class, where things get especially interesting. Every year, 1 or 2 overlooked names emerge from this group to force their way into the conversation, and this year, several players have legitimate paths to making noise. Devin Boykin is getting the most attention right now. Despite concerns about his athletic profile and a relatively low pre-draft testing score, he enters a Steelers safety room that feels surprisingly open. His reputation as a reliable tackler and run defender gives him a real chance to carve out a role, particularly on special teams. But if there's one name fans should be watching very closely, it's Kevin Jobity Jr. The defensive lineman posted a very strong athletic profile before the draft and recorded 5 sacks as an interior defender in 2025. Considering Pittsburgh only lightly addressed the defensive line during the draft, adding Gabriel Rubio later on, there may be a real opening for Jobity to challenge for depth chart positioning if he impresses during camp. That possibility says a lot about where this roster stands right now. The Steelers didn't just add players, they created competition, and competition often reveals hidden contributors faster than anything else. The bigger picture here is that Pittsburgh's 2026 class feels less about splash and more about strategic infrastructure. This front office appears focused on adding players who can contribute in specific roles immediately while still offering long-term upside. That's often how sustainable contenders are built. The real question now is whether these moves will translate quickly enough to elevate Pittsburgh in what remains one of football's toughest divisions. So when you look at everything, Bernard's upside, Aller's uncertainty, Wetjen's immediate opportunity, and the fascinating UDFA battle that's about to unfold, there's one big question every Steelers fan should be asking right now: which of these new additions do you believe will make the biggest impact first? And that question becomes even more important when you start connecting all the dots, because what's happening in Pittsburgh right now isn't just about individual players trying to make a name for themselves. It's about how all of these pieces fit together to shape the identity of this team moving forward. Take a step back and think about the balance the Steelers are trying to strike. On one side, you have a franchise that clearly believes it improved enough this offseason to climb in the power rankings and be viewed as a legitimate riser in the AFC. On the other side, you still have major questions at the most important position in football, and that tension is going to define everything we see early in the 2026 season. Because here's the reality: no matter how promising Jeremy Bernard looks, no matter how explosive Wetjen might be in the return game, and no matter which undrafted player surprises in camp, this team's ceiling will always be tied to the quarterback situation, and that's where things get really interesting. If Aaron Rodgers is indeed part of the equation, then the dynamic shifts toward a win-now mentality, but with very little margin for slow development. Rodgers historically demands precision, timing, and trust, especially from his receivers. That means a player like Bernard doesn't just need to be good, he needs to be dependable immediately. One wrong route, one missed adjustment, and opportunities can disappear quickly. But if Rodgers isn't the guy, then everything changes. Now you're looking at a scenario where either Drew Aller or Will Howard could be leading the offense, and that opens the door to a completely different style of play. Younger quarterbacks often lean more on structured reads, play design, and simplified concepts, which could actually accelerate the integration of rookies into the offense. Suddenly, Bernard's role might not just be complementary, it could expand much faster than expected, and that's where the Steelers' strategy starts to make more sense. They didn't just bring in talent, they brought in adaptable talent. Bernard is polished enough to contribute in multiple offensive looks. Wetjen provides immediate value regardless of who's at quarterback because special teams production is independent of offensive rhythm, and players like Kevin Jobity Jr. offer depth in areas where Pittsburgh quietly left room for competition, rather than locking in guaranteed starters. Even the UDFA group as a whole reflects this philosophy. Look at the variety: defensive backs, linebackers, defensive linemen, tight ends, even a kicker. This isn't a random collection of camp bodies. It's a deliberate attempt to create internal battles across multiple position groups. And when you combine that with a roster that already has some open spots, especially on defense and special teams, you start to see a pathway for at least one of these names to stick. Now here's something fans shouldn't overlook. The Steelers have a long history of finding value where other teams don't. That's part of their identity. Every year there's that one player nobody expected who earns a role and becomes part of the story. And based on what we're seeing right now, this year's class has multiple candidates to be that guy. Devin Boykin could carve out a niche purely through consistency and tackling. Jobity has the physical profile and production to push for snaps if he translates well to the next level. Even someone like Lake McCree or Shimon Matire at tight end could find a role depending on how the depth chart shakes out during camp. And that brings us to the bigger picture again. This isn't a roster that's been fully settled. It's a roster that's being actively shaped. There are opportunities here, real ones. And that's what makes this upcoming training camp one of the most intriguing in recent years for Pittsburgh. Because instead of just watching established names prepare for another season, fans are going to be watching battles, position fights, unexpected performances that could completely change how this team looks by week 1. At the same time, expectations are rising. Moving up in the power rankings might not mean much in April, but it does reflect how the league is starting to view this team. The Steelers are no longer being seen as stagnant or stuck. They're being seen as a team that's evolving, a team that made calculated moves, a team that might be building something a little more dangerous than people expected, but none of that guarantees success, because potential is one thing, execution is another, and the gap between those two is where seasons are defined. So now everything comes down to how quickly these new pieces come together, how the quarterback situation resolves itself, and which of these under-the-radar players steps up when the lights get brighter. That's the story that's just beginning to unfold. If you're following this team closely, you already know this isn't just about who they drafted, it's about what they're becoming. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these players are you watching the closest heading into camp, and do you think this roster has done enough to truly compete this season? And the deeper you go into this situation, the more it starts to feel like the Steelers are setting the stage for something that isn't going to be fully understood until we actually see it unfold on the field. Because right now, everything exists in projection. We're projecting Jeremy Bernard as a polished receiver who can contribute early. We're projecting Drew Aller as a quarterback with tools that still need to translate. We're projecting Wetjen as an immediate difference maker in the return game. And we're projecting at least one undrafted free agent, whether it's Devin Boykin or Kevin Jabadi Jr., to outperform expectations. But projection is dangerous in the NFL. Every year there are teams that win the offseason and never turn it into real results. The Steelers know that. That's why what they've done here feels a little more calculated than flashy. They didn't chase headlines, they built layers. Think about the wide receiver room for a second. Bernard stepping in as the third option isn't just about depth, it's about flexibility. It gives the offense another route technician, another reliable set of hands, and someone who can operate underneath or stretch the field depending on how he's used. That kind of versatility becomes critical when you're dealing with uncertainty at quarterback. Now shift to special teams again, because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. If Wetjen delivers on what he showed in college, you're not just talking about decent returns. You're talking about a player who can flip field position in a single play. That changes play calling. That changes how aggressive you can be on defense. That even changes how much pressure you put on your offense to sustain long drives. It's the kind of hidden impact that doesn't always show up in highlight discussions, but it shows up in wins. And then there's the defensive side of the ball, where things might get even more unpredictable. The fact that Pittsburgh didn't heavily invest in the defensive line during the draft is telling. It suggests confidence in the current group, but it also quietly opens the door for someone like Jobity to push his way into relevance. 5 sacks as an interior lineman in 2025 isn't something you ignore, especially when paired with strong athletic testing. If he carries that momentum into camp, he won't just be fighting for a roster spot. He could be forcing the coaching staff to rethink rotations, and that's where everything starts to connect again, because when you have competition at multiple levels of the roster, you create pressure, and pressure creates clarity. Players either rise or they don't. Roles either solidify or they shift. And by the time week 1 arrives, the version of the Steelers we think we're looking at right now could look very different. Now bring it back to the quarterback situation one more time, because it remains the center of everything. If Aaron Rodgers is part of this team, the expectation is immediate efficiency,